The sea wind smelled of iron and wet kelp as the host took the coastal road. The surf boomed beyond the headlands, each crash a low drum beneath the rhythm of thousands of feet and hooves. Ned kept pace beside Davos Seaworth while the king's fleet shadowed them from offshore. A scatter of cogs and galleys riding low with grain, pitch, and powder. Above, the sky wore a quilt of bruised clouds. The weathered smuggler squinted at the horizon as if reading a ledger only he could see. "Blackwater's mouth will not be naked," Davos said at length. "Cersei has galleys, and I'd wager she has a trick or two hidden in those rotten warehouses." He rubbed at his knuckles, scars white where rings had once bit until Stannis cut them. "There's talk of a chain." "A chain," Ned said. "A boom stretched across the river," Davos explained. "Anchor it to towers. Raise it when their ships row in, trap them beneath crossbow and fire." He chewed that thought and spat to leeward. "A cruel little idea, and clever. If the dwarfs in the city, it's the sort of mischief he'd favor." Ned pictured the green fork in flood, piles and ropes strung between muddy banks. A chain would make the Blackwater a bottleneck. He imagined tar-soaked barrels bobbing behind it, wick ends gleaming wildfire. The thought soured his tongue. "We'll need eyes inside," he said. "You have eyes?" Davos answered, glancing at Howland Reed, who rode silent and damp as a bittern in a marsh. "What you need is hands to pry a lock the moment your eyes tell you where it is." Howland's mouth twitched. "Marsh hands are patient," he said. "We pick locks the way herons pick minnows." They rode on. By noon the road bent through a grove of wind-twisted pines rattling like bones. Renly and Loras cantered ahead, laughter flaring as they argued over the color of banners to fly at first trumpet. Ned let their noise wash over him like rain. He watched the stormlands peel past. Hillocks tufted with gorse, gull calls drifting with the salt. A shepherd hunched on a ridge like a stone given thought. He thought of the north's long flats and whispering birches and felt how far Winterfell lay behind him. How far and how close, both true at once, as if the north rode with him inside his bones. They made camp that night above a cove where the fleet slipped into anchorage one by one, lanterns pricking darkness with a constellation of their own. In the command tent a map weighted by daggers and cups showed the bay, the city walls like a clenched fist, the river curling inland in a green-brown ribbon. Stannis stood with palms flat on the table as if he could force victory from parchment. Randall Tarly paced in a measured line. Rowan tugged his mustaches. Loras leaned hipshot against a pole. Davos warmed his hands over a brazier and watched Stannis with the weary indulgence of a man who had sailed too many storms beside the same stern captain. "We will apply pressure in 3 circles, Tarly said, rapping the quill's nib upon the map. "First encircle the city by land, entrenching earthworks south and east of the King's Gate. Second, lay a boom of our own at the bay's mouth, with redwine cogs chained and anchored. Third, send outriders into the Kingswood to intercept Tywin's messengers and confuse his provisions." "Paxter Redwine is at sea," Davos said. "His casks keep better wine than most men keep oaths." Renly's smile flashed. "We will empty both upon the Lannisters." "We will not burn men with wine," Stannis said. It came flat and iron. He set a finger where the river met the bay. "Davos, sound the bottom. If there is a chain, I want it found. If there is wildfire, I want to know where it sleeps." "It sleeps nowhere," Loras said with a shudder disguised as disdain. "It writhes in its jars, dreaming of burning." Ned traced the eastern approach with a nail. "If we can give the small folk bread at the Rose Road gate, fewer will fling stones at our men. They are hungry already. Starving rats bite anyone." Renly's eyes slid to Tarly. Tarly's jaw twitched. "Generosity breeds loyalty," he admitted, each word measured like coin. "But bread is better used to feed men who stand in ranks and hold lines than men who may loose slops and curses from behind a wall." Olenna Tyrell cleared her throat. The tent had thickened with smoke and hot bodies and order voices. Ned hadn't seen her enter. The Queen of Thorns wore travel wool the color of moss, burrs clinging as if the hedgerows adored her. She looked as out of place among helms and grease as a swift in a hawk's mew. yet eyes like needles took everything apart in a blink. "You feed the small folk," she said, "and their curses turn to prayers and their prayers to open gates. We can smuggle loaves hidden with letters, 100 to a cart, each loaf stamped with a rose. Give their bellies something to remember besides the taste of fear." Tarly opened his mouth, closed it. Stannis scowled at the map. Renly, who adored his aunt in his fashion, allowed himself a soft chuckle. "Let my Lady of Thorns prick sense into you, my lords. Bread wins hearts." Ned bowed his head to the old woman. "And letters win hands." "Letters," she echoed with the faintest curl of delight. "Birch leaves, perhaps?" Ned tried not to smile and failed. It warmed him deep, like a coal he'd carried from Winterfell tucked beneath his cloak. "Birch leaves," he agreed. "Then let's arrange our baskets." She plucked a cherry from a silver plate, crushed it between forefinger and thumb, and daubed a dot of red upon the map inside the King's Gate as if blood there were inevitable and preferable to a wider spill. "If you cannot restrain men with honor, restrain them with hope, and failing that with hunger well aimed." After the council broke, she drew Ned aside beneath an awning where rain drummed. The sea hissed, lanterns swung. He saw that age had not gentled her mouth. "You climb a gallows for my letter, Lord Stark," she said, not unkindly. "And you climb down again by stealth and luck. Most men break one way or the other and never stand upright after. Necessity shapes posture," he said. She studied his face as if reading a history in a ruined book. "I like how you lie." "I do not lie." "Oh, you lie to yourself every morning, about war, about mercy, about how much ugliness you will allow in pursuit of a pretty thing. I like that kind of lie because it keeps a man from becoming the ugliness he serves." She patted his sleeve. "Next time I send you a letter asking you to conspire, bring your wife and let us ladies contrive something sensible." He found himself smiling, and in the smile a pain. Catelyn's hands, the way she smoothed a coif in thought, the way she told him once that the quickest way to disarm a man was to feed his children. "If we pull Sansa and Arya from the Queen's fists," he said, "I will bring Catelyn to scold you for plucking wolves by their tails." "Do," she said. "I am fond of wolves who do not bite their own tongues." Before dawn, Davos went out with 3 skiffs and 4 eelfishers in reed-colored cloaks. Howland sent 2 of his crannigs with him, spare men whose faces would be forgotten before their oars had dried. They slid into fog so thick it tasted of wet stone. When they returned at mid-morning, the fog had thinned and Davos smelled of rot and river. He spread a crude chart he'd pricked with a fishbone in lampblack. "Here," he said, fingernail tapping a crescent drawn at the river's mouth. A line of iron lodged on pilings submerged in the channel where the current narrows. The chain is slung loose now, lying on the bottom. Raise the capstan. The chain sprouts like a serpent and closes the throat. "Where's the winch?" Renly asked. "Under a warehouse by the King's Gate," Davos said. "Alchemists crawl all over it, and a score of gold cloaks guard the door like dogs full of glue." "Wildfire?" Stannis asked. Davos's face creased, as if he took a bite of something and found it not to his liking. "A warehouse full of clay pots. I dared not tap one. The way they looked at their own shadows, you'd think they tumbled bed with ghosts. The air near those jars felt hot. My oars smoked." "The Hound will love that," Renly muttered half to Loras. "The Hound will flee that," Loras said with a private little smile. "And maybe flee right to us." "We cannot trust cowardice," Stannis said. "We can trust terror to behave like itself," Olenna replied. Ned let the talk eddy around him and thought of a grate beneath the red keep that breathed a thread of sea air and a child with needle in hand and a talent for vanishing into dark. He had not seen Arya since the day the lion seized him and he yielded to save her throat. He had not heard her voice, yet the certainty of her survival ran like a track of iron beneath his breastbone. Arya was winter quick. Winter killed men who stood still, but not things that moved like foxfire. He closed his eyes and pictured her, nose wrinkled, hair in her eyes, counting steps the way he counted heartbeats. In King's Landing the heat already pressed like a hand. The gutters stank of fish guts, wine, ordure, and smoke. The flies had woke early and bit greedy. Cersei Lannister descended the steps to the alchemist's guild with a scarf at her nose. Pycelle tottered in her shadow, Varys minced behind, and Peter Baelish walked as if to a revel where he knew the punch was poisoned but the laughter would be worth it. Within the guild hall, the master of pyromancers bowed thrice, his bald skull gleaming. "Your grace," he murmured, and the room bowed with him, each man's ritual nearly swallowing the little wick of common sense flickering in his eyes. The jars they loved sat in rows behind them like an orchard of sickly fruit. "Show me," Cersei said. They showed her. A jar opened with maddening care. A smell like sour apples and rot. A liquid like green glass with a hunger of its own. A pinch taken with a bone spoon, dropped upon wet straw. It burned with a light like emerald noon. It burned beneath a bowl of water. It set the spoon's tip to sizzling. "It will not be used in the city," Pycelle said faintly. The histories, Cersei said, were written by men who feared to do what must be done." She made a gesture with her hand, a habit that always made Ned think of cutting threads. "If the wolf and the stag and the rose march upon my walls, they will taste dragonfire in the mouths of men." Baelish steepled his fingers. "Dragonfire in the mouths of fevers and bred riots in the bellies of small folk," he said. "Shall we feed them both? Feed them meat pies stamped with wolves' heads? For all I care," Cersei snapped, then moderated her tone because Pycelle was whispering something about smoke and sky and how a wind from the east made fire crawl. She turned instead to Varys. "Renly rides with Highgarden?" "He does," Varys said. His eyes were as mild as milk. He bent knee to Stannis, though few saw it. "The story already splits in the telling." "Let it split," she said. "We will sew it together again with gold." She pointed a fingernail at Baelish. "And with coin you arrange." Baelish bowed. "The City Watch eat better on a Lannister purse than on a Baratheon promise. Though I hear the Tyrells bake an excellent loaf. There will be no bread at my gate that does not pay my toll," Cersei said. "Joffrey decrees it." "He decrees what you whisper, your grace," Baelish said, eyes amused. "Which is well. Boys who shout are adored. Women who plan are forgotten, until the moment they cut a throat." Her mouth made a line. "Arrange the watch. Arrange the kettles on the walls. Arrange the chain. And do you arrange the faith?" he asked, casual as a cat. She had arranged the faith. She had pressed coin and flattery upon the High Septon until he'd thanked her for the grease beneath his slipper and promised a sermon about bastardy and law. She had arranged a red priestess as well, the woman called Melisandre who had come with whispers on a black ship and said fire ate lies. Cersei liked the woman's certainty. She liked the way men looked away from that certainty as if it could blister the eyes. She liked that certainty even if she did not believe in gods. In the cellars beneath the guild hall, a cat hissed at a shadow. The shadow paused, then slid along a wall where torchlight pooled like oil. Arya Stark crept on elbows across damp stone. Hair a tangle, cheeks dirty, needle hugged to her chest so the thin blade did not clatter. She had crawled here by counting. 6 steps beyond the skull's broken tooth, 20 steps beyond the third sconce, 3 left turns, 1 right turn, a ladder that smelled of iron, a rung with a splinter that snagged her sleeve. She had a knife wound on her forearm where a rat bit her and she had bit him back. She had a map of the cellars drawn in grease under her left sleeve and the fear of losing it branded in her bones. She listened. The alchemists above muttered and scraped. The queen's voice was a silk rasp. Arya closed her eyes and saw Sansa's face and remembered father's hands. She could not get to the jars, too many men, too much light. But she could mark the door's hinges with chalk, and chalk was what she had stolen from a scribe's table. She crawled to a hinge and made a tiny cross. She made another on the stone by the winch. She drew a birch leaf no bigger than a fingernail, then wiped away half of it so only the stem showed. If anyone looked, they would see a smear. If Howland Reed's marshmen found it, they might see a sign that a wolf girl had been here. She pressed her forehead to the cold stone, breathed twice, and flowed back into the dark. When she found the grate that breathed the sea, she went flat and slid like a coin under a door, wriggling until her ribs ached. Cold salt air sliced her lungs. She lay on the tide-browned rocks beneath the quay and watched boots cross above her in a rhythm. When a cart rolled past, flour, she followed its shadow like a fish follows a boat, then darted into a stack of fish crates where a rat threatened to bite her maimed arm, and she clacked needle on the wood so it fled. From there she saw the river beyond the pilings and the oars that dipped and the shapes of boats in fog. She saw a skiff slide close and a man lift a hand. She lifted her own, all 5 fingers. He lifted 2. She lifted 1. He lifted 3. The code Renly's men had given a baker's boy in a tavern where Arya sat under a bench, invisible as a penny. She did not know what the numbers meant, only that when all the fingers had been raised, the skiff would slide in and drop a bundle. She watched. The hands fluttered. The skiff kissed the slime-slick stone, and a bundle thumped the quay. Bread wrapped in waxed linen. A woman in a shawl took it and pretended not to take it. Arya saw a slit in the bread and a curl of birch bark inside. She waited until the woman vanished into the stink of flea bottom. She waited longer. Then she slid into the water that clawed at its walls and came up below the pilings and made herself a shadow that moved toward the beach where the poor washed their blankets and wept. She had one thought: find the woman. She found 3 others like her by the time she found the first: gray faces, hollow cheeks, hands like claws around the loaves. She watched the first woman tear the bread in her hovel beneath a sloped roof that leaked. She watched her lick the crumb off her fingers. She watched her daughter pull out the birch bark as if it were a worm and squeal. Arya slid through the gap in the door and took the bark. The woman gasped. The girl shrieked. "Shoo!" Arya said, and put her finger to her lips, then to the bark, and then tapped her heart twice. "This is mine," she whispered, and the woman, who had been beaten enough to understand how to survive, nodded and looked away. Arya left 2 copper pennies on the floor and took the bark and the smallest heel of bread. The bark said, "At moon low open the fishmonger's gate. Your friends stand beyond. Lift the bar and run." She ate the bread slowly. She drew her knees to her chest. She counted her breaths until the moon was a bitten nail, and then she ran. Sansa dreamed of a white birch etched into ice. She woke with her heart galloping and the septa's snores a rasp. Candlelight threw her shadow long on the hangings. On the table by her bed lay a posy of herbs, rosemary, lavender, and something else with a bitter clean smell. It had never been there before. Sansa sat up and stared. Between the sprigs lay a brooch, a tiny 6-petaled rose wrought in silver with a pin that did not belong to the set. She picked it up with hands that were not steady and turned it over. On the back, etched faintly, a line no jeweler would have wasted work to make: the vein of a leaf. She wept then, not in the way she had learned to weep in the queen's chamber so her tears would be pretty as pearls, but the way she wept when she skinned her knee at 7 and thought she had lost a lark. She wept softly into the herbs so they drank her, and when she was done she pinned the brooch beneath her collar so no one would see it unless they were asked to look. In the morning, the queen came with news that fell from her mouth like cold coins. "Stannis has landed," she said. "He drags your father behind him like a rag. You must pray for the king." Sansa folded her hands. "I pray for the king," she said, and thought of a different king. The one who had died laughing, bloody, stupid, beloved, and almost smiled at the memory despite the sting of it. Cersei pinched her chin between finger and thumb and tilted. "And I pray for you, child," she murmured, as if that were kindness. After the queen left, Sandor Clegane came to stand at her door with a mug of watered ale and a face like a wound. He did not ask to enter. He leaned in the doorway with his burned cheek to the light so the scars showed bright. Sansa looked at him because it was easier to look than to look away. "They'll come," he said. "Who?" "Wolves and roses." He sneered at his own show of poetry. "I'll smell them before I see them. Wolves stink of horse and honest sweat. Roses smell like powder. Both smell better than wildfire." She found her voice. "You are brave," she said. He barked a laugh. "I am not. That's why I'm still alive. She held his gaze. Cowards live and brave men die. But brave men also live sometimes. That must confuse you. He studied her as if she had lifted a shield. It does, he admitted. He stared into the mug and then away. If fire comes, run where the dogs run. Instinct beats orders, little bird. The host moved north again. The sea fell away on their left, the city swelled on their right, and the fields between grew pocked with campfires and the raw edges of hastily dug ditches. The king's banner ran stiff in a resentful wind. The rose banners fluttered, soft like leaves. Ned watched a line of carts creak toward the King's Road gate under Tyrell livery. Barrels with false bottoms, loaves by the hundred, sacks of oats with letters sewn into seams. A brewer's wife in a plain gown and a baker's boy with bad teeth drove them. Both wore the rose when no one was looking and nothing at all when anyone was. The guards at the gate counted loaves, pinched in respect to their office, one from each tenth, and let the carts through with curses. The small folk gathered beyond like gulls, desperate and quick. Bread found hands, hands found letters, letters found eyes, eyes found doors and bars and hinges. When the red wine fleet hove into sight at last, it came in a wedge of white sails, each marked with a bunch of grapes, as if a vineyard had uprooted itself and sailed. The galleys slid into position with the ease of men who had learned before they learned to walk the difference between a rope taut and a rope with a promise of slack. They dropped anchors and cast chains as wide as fields. Davos took a dozen boats among them, nodding to old rivals with an amiable contempt. The lines went out. The bay narrowed. On the second night of encirclement, a bell tolled in the city, mournful as a cow on whose calf a butcher had placed his hand. The sound rolled across the water and up the entrenchments where Stannis's men sat their posts. Ned lay with his cloak under his head and his sword drawn beside him. Howland lay on the other side of the little fire, eyes closed like a man in prayer, though Ned knew the Crannog's mind was as busy as a frog pond at dusk. He listened to that bell and thought that if a city could speak its own grief, it would sound like that, slow, heavy, hung between hope and surrender. In the third dawn, a rider came under a white flag. A woman with hair the color of honey and a face like a blade. Brienne of Tarth rode beside her. Loras went out to meet them, visor up. Stannis watched from the ridge, Renly from the stair beside him, Ned on foot because he preferred to meet some truths on the ground. The woman reined her horse and looked at them each as if testing their weight. "I am Allery Hightower, Lady of Old Town," she said. "I bring you my husband's fleet and my father's word. Old Town stands with Highgarden and with the king named by law." Beside Ned, Tarly grunted, a noise half acceptance, half resignation. Renly bowed as if she handed him a gem. Stannis nodded once, perhaps the largest grace he could summon without choking. Then Lady Allery turned to Ned. "And I bring a letter for you, Lord Stark, from a lady with sharp thorns." He took the letter and broke the seal, which showed a spider someone had stepped on but not killed. The writing pricked. "Your bread will be eaten. Your letters will be read. Your daughters will be taken to the gate at Moon's Low, and if you do not catch them there, I shall find you and flay your honor with it." He understood only the first part as blessing. The second was a promise and a threat and a kindness, all the old woman's gifts in one bundle. He folded the letter and tucked it behind his breast. When the moon lowered itself to the proof of the dock posts that night, two things happened at once. At the fishmonger's gate, 3 watch sergeants drowsed with pikes crossed while a boy pissed into the gutter and sang a dirty rhyme to keep fear away. The street beyond lay slick with fish blood and the torches burned low, more ember than flame. From inside, a soft scrape, a breath. One sergeant lifted his head, frowning. The crossbar shuddered. It was heavy oak, old as the stones. He blinked ale from his eyes. "Saw you that?" he asked the second sergeant. The second sergeant showed him his palm, and in it a tiny leaf of birch peeled from a loaf. He had found 5 that day. He had put one in his mouth to see if it tasted like anything. It had tasted like bark. He did not know why he had kept one in his hand. Arya had pushed until her shoulder felt as if it would crack. She had wedged her foot between bar and floor. She had pressed her mouth to the wood and bitten her teeth into splinters to stop herself from screaming with the effort. She had bled from 3 places. Sansa stood beside her, white as her name, with the rose brooch pinned inside her collar and the smell of lavender plastering her throat. She had never lifted a bar, and yet she did now with both hands and all the trust she had left in the world that had not yet been broken into dust. Outside, 2 men walked with fishermen's shoulders. One of them had eyes like marsh water and the other had a patch of nettle on his sleeve, and neither of them spoke. The bar lifted enough for a breath to pass. It dropped. It lifted again, an inch too. Sansa wept quietly, like a girl learning she had muscles she had not used, like a woman learning she had a choice she could take. Arya hissed in her ear. Again. They pushed. Outside the gate, the sergeant with the bark in his hand made a decision that would not make it into any book, because it came down to the simplest human arithmetic. His child had eaten bread that day. He spat, stepped forward, and shouldered the bar up as if to ease a cramp. The second sergeant pretended to scratch his arse. The third looked away, at the river, where fog moved like a beast breathing. The boy pissing finished and looked down and said, "Ha!" and then hiccuped. The bar slid. The gate gaped a finger's width, a hand's width, a child's width. Howland Reed's fingers slid into that gap, brown and tough, and he set his other hand upon the stone and looked Arya in the eyes and nodded as if they were at a pond watching dragonflies dance. "Come," he murmured, for old gods heard whispers best. Sansa took his hand as if it were a rope thrown to a drowning swimmer. Arya slipped through like smoke. They came out into fog that smelled of the river and bread and the first taste of tears that would not be spent. "Here," Howland said, and his men took the girls and turned them into bundles and slid them beneath fish on a handcart with the terrifying gentleness of men placing their sons in the earth. Sansa lay on her back with cold scales on her cheek and the sense that she had been born again into something salt and raw and honest. Arya lay with her knife on her belly and counted the boards between her and the sky so she would not jump up and stab at shadows. The cart creaked, took a corner. In the gatehouse, the sergeant put his hand in his pocket where the birch had been and closed his fist on nothing and decided he would tell no one anything, ever again. At the same moment across the city, at the Alchemist's Guild, a spider that had been stepped on but not killed skittered across a shelf and a pot-bellied candle guttered and a jar sweated. A drop slid down its side with the slow inevitability of a law. The red priestess in the queen's solar stiffened, as if a wind had cupped her face and whispered a name. On the river, Davos felt a tug in his hands as if the current had grown a tooth. He leaned his weight into the oar, looking at the water where nothing showed, and thought, chain. By dawn the girls lay in a tent that smelled of eel and nettle and spun wool. Olenna Tyrell sat on a stool with a mending basket and a sword across her lap that she had borrowed from a guard and did not use. She looked at Sansa's face, which had become a woman's face while she was not looking. She looked at Arya's, which had become something else entirely. A knife drawn from a sheath and refusing to go back. She clicked her tongue. "Well," she said, "you both look like trouble." Sansa tried to sit and failed. "Father?" she asked through a throat full of splinters. Olenna rose. "We will not waste the best part with the worst child." She opened the tent flap. Ned came in so quickly he knocked a cup with his hip. He did not notice. He went to his knees the way he had in the throne room, only this time the stone did not bruise. This time the chains were only the ones he broke when he reached for them both. He held Sansa and Arya and smelled their hair, fish and sweat and river and tears, and thanked a God who had made no promise to answer that he had no right to ask and asked anyway. Arya squirmed free first. "We drew a birch leaf," she said, with a fierce pride that had no place to be stored yet. "I heard jars, and a chain, and I saw the winch. I marked the hinge." "You did," he said, and his voice went somewhere he could not follow for a heartbeat. He kissed her dirty brow and then Sansa's salt cheek, and when he stood his knees shook. Stannis came soon after, not by choice, Ned thought, but out of a surprised recognition that the thing had happened which men wrote songs about whether they wanted to or not. He looked down at the girls and up at Ned, and whatever he thought stayed behind his teeth. But he said, "They'll not be hostages to us, Stark. They'll be my daughters," Ned said. "Do not make the same mistake twice," Stannis said. "Keep them where the Queen cannot reach." "Where is that?" Ned asked, and smiled a wolf smile that was not warm. "In a moving army," Stannis said, dry. "For now." Renly brought honeyed milk like a nurse, because that is what he was in some part of him, even when he pretended to play at crowns. Loras brought a clean shirt and stood inside the tent as if it were a shrine. Tarly sent a bowl of broth with 3 cubes of beef in it, as if rationing kindness and thought no one saw. Howland took the bowl before anyone could spoil it with apology and fed Sansa between breath and breath until color came back to her mouth. By afternoon the camp knew. Wagons creaked. A murmur traveled like the wind in corn. Men glanced up and smiled and did not know why. In the city, the Queen erupted like the thing in the jar when flame licked it. She sent for the sergeants at the fishmonger's gate. She never saw them because the watch captain told her they had died in a tavern fight and then lost the report and then lost his own hand and could not write another. She struck Baelish across the cheek not because it was his fault but because he would not stop smiling. He bowed over her blow like a courtier over a favor. She told Varys to fetch the Red Woman. He fetched her. The Red Woman looked into a brazier and said, "I see a man on a wall of swords and a woman with knives for fingers. Tell me how to kill them," Cersei said. Melisandre shook her head. "You cannot kill a winter that has not finished eating." The encirclement tightened. Trenches reached like fingers toward the gates. The red wine chains sang in the tide. Davos brought back word of the boom chain inside the river, the winch beneath the guild hall, the sconces in the tunnel, the pattern of patrols. Howland's marshmen slid out by night and returned with smudges on their faces that had not been there before and a coil of heavy rope that had until last night been part of the winch's life. Ned stood above the works near the King's Gate and watched the city. It had a beauty of its own even under siege. The way the sun smeared copper across the domes, the rippling of laundry like flags of 1,000 white houses, the line of the walls like a scab forming on a wound. He felt no hatred for it. He felt an old, grave pity, the pity a hunter feels for a stag panting with broken foreleg while the hounds sing the old song. He found that pity a useful check on the anger that came like a black tide when he thought of his girls under that roof. He did not know if he would see winter again in Winterfell. He did not know if he would see Bran climb. He knew only this: the law had to be placed upon the chair of blades, and men had to believe in it enough to die and enough to live. "Tomorrow," Stannis said behind him, having come up like a shadow that refused to be surprised by its own silence, "we send a last demand at dawn. At noon we test their chain. At dusk we set the first trebuchet stone." "And in the night?" Ned asked. "In the night," Stannis said, "we pray to gods we do not trust." "Pray to bread," Renly said, half jesting and half not, as he joined them with Loras and Tarly in his wake. "We will throw loaves over their walls if stone fails. We will feed them into our arms." "Pray to good hinges," Howland said, appearing with his cloak full of smell of marsh. He held up a greasy rag with a smear that to any other eye would have been dirt. To Ned it was chalk spread by a child's finger in the shape of half a leaf. "Tomorrow," Ned said. He slept that night beside his daughters in a little square of canvas walled in by men who would kill anything that tried to step into that square. He woke twice, once when a gull cried like a woman, once when Arya's knife slid in her sleep and he put his hand over it without waking her. He dreamed of birches in snow, and of the sound a city makes when it chooses to live. When dawn came, pale and without drama, Stannis's herald rode to the gate in a shirt of white with a black stag over it, and he read a long thing that Ned had written in the words of the law and Davos had trimmed with common sense and Olenna had pricked to make it bleed in the right places. It said the queen must bring her children to the gate and submit to trial. It said the council that had signed the will must step forward and say whether they had, indeed, put quill to that parchment. It said the city must open its gates to bread and mercy and order. The watch upon the wall laughed down and said something about arrows. The herald rode back with 6 of them in his shield and a grin because he was alive and because sometimes men laugh when they are terrified and cannot help that the other sound would break them. At noon Davos rowed 2 boats into the river slack. The fog did not come to dress him. The sun sat on the water and pretended to be a coin. He and his men dropped a grapnel, pulled, and felt the deep thrumming of chain. On both banks archers tensed, but nothing flew. The city slept in heat. Davos winked at the boat beside him and cut the rope. Men swore in 3 languages. Then cheer rose sharper because they had touched the thing and not died. Touching was a kind of victory. After that, all afternoon the siege sang with hammer and saw and the occasional cry, with a rhythm that made even fear feel obedient. Near dusk, the first trebuchet stone went up, a gray moon raised by wood and will and mathematics. Swung, it loosed, it arced. It struck the wall just beside the king's gate with a sound like a skull splitting. Dust jumped. Birds lifted in startled clatter. The wall answered by existing. That was war. 2 existences arguing with stones. Another stone. Another. The wall stood. The city stood. Night fell. In that night, when tents made a second city and fires drew the eye like temptations and the sea whispered, Ned walked a last circuit. He did not do it to check lines. Others had that duty now and did it with more zeal and better numbers. He did it to put his feet on the dirt of a decision. He stopped by Davos's fire. The man bent over a rope as if it were a prayer. Chain? Ned asked. We'll break it, Davos said. Every chain breaks. Only the good ones take longer. He looked up. Your girls sleep. They do, Ned said. He hesitated. Thank you. Davos snorted, not in mockery but in the way a man snorts at a compliment he thinks is unfair. Tell me that when your king sits where a boy sits now, that will be thanks enough. Ned moved on. He stopped at Renly's pavilion. There was laughter within, a weightless thing, the last of its kind for a while. He stopped at Stannis's. There was silence within, heavy as a closed book. He stopped at Howland's low canvas lean-to. There was the sound of frogs from a bowl. The crannogman had brought them, the way other men brought salt for luck. He stopped last at the sea, where the red wine chains hummed and the fleet rocked and water matched breath with the earth. He stood there until the sky went from ink to charcoal and the birds in the Kingswood began to gossip. He looked at the wall. He looked at the gate. He looked at the river's mouth and imagined a chain rising like a steel snake to strangle ships and men. He imagined a city that had been hungry and proud and cruel and ordinary, opening its mouth and saying a different word than the one king's demanded. He did not know what word the city chose. He would find out. He touched the hilt of ice. He did not draw it. Behind him, the camp stirred to trumpet and drum. Before him, the city woke to bell and cry. Between them lay a strip of world thin as a whetted blade. He stepped toward it. The space between drum and bell narrowed until it felt like a held breath. In the pale hour before sun spilled itself fully upon the bay, dew clung to every pennon and lash and braided mane. Men moved softly through their tasks, boots whispering against tamped earth, lips chapped to cracking by salt and wind. Ned walked among them and felt a quiet he recognized from wolf hunts and winter storms. Not the shrillness of panic, but the sober steadiness of creatures that understand cold and hunger and do the next small thing until their hands forget to shake. The battering rams waited beneath mantlets like sleeping animals with hard skulls and iron teeth. Fresh-cut green hides draped their frames, wet enough to steam where coals snapped in braziers close by. Rows of wicker shields leaned against trench faces, their woven bellies dark from last night's mist. Along the low ridges where bowmen knelt, stringers drew hemp tight and tested arrow flights against the morning's damp. Behind, carts of bread jolted toward the Rose Road gate, Tyrell teamsters tossing loaves into outstretched hands of small folk who had crept past gullies and hedge lines in ones and threes, faces pinched and eyes sharp for both bread and letters. The letters hid where Olenna said they would be, tucked in the split seam of a loaf or stitched flat under the braid of twine binding a sack. No one shouted about hope. They simply passed it hand to hand like a hot stone that might warm more than fingers. Stannis took his place on a cut bank where the road widened, Davos at his shoulder and Tarly on his other side. The king's standard lifting and falling in a wind that came sour from the city. Renly stood a little below, helm tucked beneath his arm, Loras beside him, visor up to show a face scrubbed clean and coltish with sleep not quite shorn away. Howland Reed lingered among a handful of his crannigs at the edge of a reed-choked ditch. He had a stick in hand and traced wet lines on the soil with the precision of a priest drawing runes. Ned joined him for a moment and looked down. "Marks?" Ned asked. "Streams," Howland said. "Runoff from last night's rains. It will puddle here first when men run. Men always run downhill." He wiped the stick and nodded toward the city. "So we put our nets there." "You lay nets for men," Ned said, not sure if he meant it as question or admonition. "For fear," Howland answered, mild. "It is the only thing worth catching before it multiplies." Ned touched his shoulder. They spoke seldom of the Tower of Joy, and not at all of how a net like the Crannigs had once kept 3 Kingsguard from overwhelming a wounded man. But the memory lived with them like a quiet animal that sat beside their fire and kept its own counsel. Howland's gaze flicked to the girl's small tent 2 lines behind, where Arya had already slipped out to pester an archer about his elbow, and Sansa sat on a campstool with a scrap of linen in her hands that looked like nothing until one saw the tiny birch leaf she stitched at one corner with thread so pale it barely showed. She was copying no pattern and no lady's sampler. She stitched the shape because it was the only shape she trusted. When she finished, she folded the linen, wrote a few words upon it with a careful hand, and slid it into a basket of bread bound for a washerwoman she remembered from a day she had watched the river from a balcony and pretended not to see the way men looked at her when they thought no one would notice. A herald rode forward once more, white shirt over mail, voice clear as cold water. He called the terms until his throat rasped. He spoke of law and will and trial, and of bread allowed freely. He named names: Jaime Lannister, brother to the Queen; Pycelle, sworn to dispassion; Baelish, sworn to coin; Varys, sworn to shadows. He did not call for Joffrey to be pulled down from the dais by his hair. He called for the paper to be brought to light before gods and men. The watch upon the wall jeered Lou. "Cess this time." Some of them spat, because spitting is a thing men do when their mouths go dry and their hands have nothing yet to break. By the king's gate, a kettle of oil snarled over flame as if impatient to be borne into harm. A captain lifted its lid and then put it down again with a face like a man who has leaned too close to the mouth of a dog on a chain. He chewed a sliver of birch ever since he found one where his boot met the step at the fishmonger's gate. He chewed it now until it softened and turned to pulp. He told his men to keep the oil warm, not boiling. They did not ask why. Orders that sound like caution pass easily through fear. On the river, the red wine chains vibrated and hummed as the tide turned, and men who slept below deck turned on their pallets and reached for knives without waking. Davos stood on a low pier the engineers had thrown across the shallows, one foot upon the slick wood, the other on a stone that had worn round backs and narrow shoulders smooth over 100 years. He lifted a hand, a simple half-circle of palm that meant wait. 2 skiffs drew close. The men in them wore reed-colored cloaks and the expression of men who prefer not to be watched by gods or men when they do the work they must. "Slack is ours," Davos said quietly. "We jammed the Paul last night. Their capstan will grind and bite air. Unless they built a new ratchet," one of the Crannigs said. "Unless," Davos agreed and showed his teeth briefly. "Everything is unless until a boat runs the chain and does not split her ribs on iron. Then it is, was, and did, and how many still breathe?" "How many still breathe?" the Crannig echoed, as if tasting the phrase. Ned took up his place among a line of northern men who had come south with only 3 banners and a memory for winter that needed no cloth to announce itself. Hallie's Hornwood stood at his left, his face sunken from too much riding and not enough sitting still. To Ned's right waited a Mormont woman whose beard a boy could have envied. Her jaw set, her spear but resting in the crook of her knee. They did not talk of home because words frayed too quickly. They stood, watched the city, and remembered the sound of snow on roof slates. The first test came not with a trumpet but with a tug on rope, on breath, on nerves. Davos signaled. The skiffs slid forward and let their lines droop, hooks dragging the bottom until one caught and jerked a wrist so hard the man swore in a tongue older than Old Town. The line went taut as a throat under a blade. The men dug heels and backs and shoulders into their boats and pulled. The rope did not come up slack. It shivered. It sang. Then something somewhere grated and skipped like teeth skipping a notch, and the rope came an inch, 2, 3, and then steadied. The men rocked with the release and looked to Davos. Again, he said. They pulled until their hands blistered and their arms burned, and the chain did not rise further, but neither did it leap like a hooked thing eager to answer its masters. Davos spat into the water and nodded once, satisfied as a fisherman who feels a fish's head shake and knows it is hooked good enough to tire and land. Night will tell us whether the jam holds, he told Ned later. Daylight makes men complacent. Darkness teaches them how much they wrong their own hands. How long will men hold their courage in the dark? Ned asked. Davos's mouth twisted. Long enough to do what they must, if their bellies are not empty and their wives are not within earshot of burning. Ned thought of Caitlin on a tower walk, wind tonguing her hair, eyes narrowed against a sun too bright for her Tully blood. He thought of Winterfell's inner walls, where fire could be contained and directed, and of the Red Keep where he had seen fire likelier to run wild. He looked to the city and did not love it any more this hour than the last. He pitied it more. Inside those walls, a red woman stood before a brazier whose coals had gone white, and she let her breath slow to the pace of a viper's heartbeat. She saw shadows move against the far stones and told herself they were only shadows. She told herself many things. She told herself the boy with the gold hair and the petulant mouth was a king enough for what was needed, a sacrifice that would raise a song of fear high enough to drown out men's doubts. She told herself the queen's wrath was fuel. She told herself the city would stand because fire liked walls. She watched her breath rise and fall and thought she felt under it something older than breath. Then she watched it slip away when the door opened and the queen stepped in, hair unbound, eyes bright, the smell of wine and roses and fatigue riding her like a horse too often flogged. "Can you give me a night without dreams?" the queen asked. "No," the woman said, "but I can give you a night with fire. It will be brighter." The queen made a sound that could have been laughter or weeping. "Light the jars and we will all be brighter," she said, and closed her eyes as if an image there would be less cruel than the one the window would give. On the 4th day of encirclement, the bread wagons reached the Rose Road gate at the same hour they always did, because one cannot make men trust timing by changing it. The guards counted loaves more cautiously, their fingers working the rough crusts with less hunger. Word of the letters had found them, though not their form. They tipped one loaf and found a curl of bark stitched up under the seam and scowled and passed it back to the woman who waited with eyes too open for the hour. A boy in the second wagon pretended to adjust the strap on his shoe and slid a letter under the wheel rim for a farrier whose brother wore the black of the watch and hated the gold of the cloaks more than he hated hunger. 2 girls, hair ragged and eyes bright, walked along the ditch and picked crumbs that fell from careless hands. One found a scrap of linen with a leaf stitched on it and would not let go even when a man cuffed her ear to see if the linen would fly and leave the bread to him. In Baylor's September, the High Septon wiped his brow 3 times, shifted upon a cushion, and then thundered in the well-practiced register that made whispers travel as far as shouts if they were carried upon authority. He spoke of sin and the wages of sin and the exactions of law and the kindness of queens and the wickedness of men who claimed law when law did not favor them. He did not say king. He said order and peace and household, and the 7 little men in their niches looked down at him and did not offer correction. An old woman in the 3rd pew reached beneath her cloak and placed a loaf with a rose stamped on its heel in her lap with the quiet devotion of one who knows what a miracle is and will not stop to argue over its provenance. At noon, a messenger came in under a white flag and asked to speak to Stannis. He was brought to a strip of ground where 3 cart ruts had dried into something like clay. He was a gold-cloaked captain with a split lip and a healed scar across the ridge of his nose, and the perplexed look of a man who has not slept because a thing he thought could be done in one way must now be done in another. He bowed and held out a token. A wooden disc, rough-carved, with the rudest shape of a leaf upon it. "I took this from a boy who had it tied to his wrist with string," he said. "He said a baker gave it to him. He said it meant someone would see him." "What do you want us to see?" Stannis asked. That the gold cloaks are not all the queens. The man swallowed. Half are coin and half are bread. The bread will not march if you burn them. The bread will open a gate if it sees a way to do it and live after. What gate? Tarly asked at once, sharp as a hawk reading a rabbit start beneath grass. Not the king's, the captain said. Not while the dwarf neatens his chain. Not the lions too close to the keep. The rose road if bread keeps coming. Or the mud, if you do not mind filth. Men will wade through worse than mud, Renly said softly. That I know. You take coin from 2 purses then, Tarly said to the captain without judgment or contempt. I take it from all purses, the captain said. And I take bread from all ovens. I will do what lets my men live. If that is your law, I will live inside it. If it is hers, I will live inside that. But the gold cloaks cannot eat wildfire. They can eat bread. Stannis's gaze never left the man's face. If you open a gate, command your men to stand down. If they stand aside, they will live. If they lift a hand against my men in a moment of fury, they may find their hands cut off later by a man less patient than I am. I do not doubt it, the captain said. He touched his forehead with his fingers in a gesture that was not quite a salute and not quite a prayer and turned to go. Your name, Ned said on impulse before the man reached the white flag's pole. The captain turned his head. I keep it, he said, and went out to where the city's heat could take him back. The afternoon passed in the labor that hides fear. A fresh trench cut where the last one filled with groundwater. A train of oxen brought up to haul the siege tower that had taken 200 hands to raise and would take 20 to push against wind. Men sang something that would not hold on any court's tongue and did not need to. Renly and Loras sparred without lances, on foot and laughing until the rain slicked their hair, then laughing more because they slipped and went down like boys. Brienne of Tarth stood with her hands on the hilt of her sword and did not laugh and watched each step with an attention that would one day save a life or end one. Sansa stayed close to the women who cooked and the men who mended and spoke to both as if both were equal. She learned which pot boiled fastest and which mender set a stitch that would not rip when a man bled under it. When Olenna scolded a man who tried to steal a second cup of beer, Sansa scolded him too and discovered that authority, used sparingly, tasted like steel and like honey both. She did not look toward the city when she did it. She looked at the ladle. She did not want to know yet how much of her would be required to look up at those walls and not choke. Arya lay on her belly at the lip of a trench and watched a spider spin a web across the notch of a split stake. She whispered the names she whispered when she could not sleep, not in a fury, but because the saying of them kept the faces distinct and the anger warm without burning her. She added one name she had not said before, because she had never known it, though she had known the man's face, Randall Tarly. She did not know yet whether he belonged on the list with the others. She put him there lightly, the way one places a pebble on a cairn to see if it will slide off when the wind and rain come. She told herself she would remove it if he did not send men where they would be spent for nothing. She told herself she could take a name off the list if she needed to. Then she knew she lied and laughed at herself with a hard little breath that only she ever heard. At twilight, a man came to the lines with a dog at his heel. He wore no helm and his helm was his face. The scars on it shone lighter in the last light than the rest of him, which was dark as if the day had smoked him. He walked like a man who expected arrows and had stopped bargaining for whether they found him. When the first sentry leveled a spear, the dog showed its teeth and the man growled back, and no one could say truly which growl came first. Sandor Clegane lifted empty hands and stepped forward until the spear point touched his chest and left a dark dot on the leather. Tell Stark, he said, or tell the boy who thinks he's king, or tell the one who thinks he's his father. Tell whichever of them thinks he can listen. The jars are not only in the guild hall. The queen has them up in the Red Keep cellars and under the sept and in the tower by the river. She means to light the water green if she must. She means to light her own floors. Why? The sentry demanded. Because men ask that word when they cannot ask others. Because she would rather be Queen of Ash than not a queen, Sandor said. His voice was flat. And because the dwarf made a toy chain and does not mind toys that cut men to pieces when they break. Ned came at a run that felt like a fall controlled just enough to spare his knees. He looked once at Sandor and saw only flame on the boy's face, the ghost of it, and the way a dog's hackles lift when the men around it smell oil. He did not say the hound's name. He said, "Where?" Sandor told him. He told him where the jars lay under the rookery in the Red Keep where the stones ran cool. He told him where the jars lay near the pier where Davos had said his oars smoked. He told him where the chain crank had its second ratchet, built by a smith who liked copper and had a limp. He told them in the voice of a man removing the last splinters of a thing from under his skin. "And why are you telling us?" Renly asked, who had come because at heart he could not resist a moment where a man might become an ally in the space of a breath. Sandor made that bark of laughter again that was neither laughter nor purely contempt. "Because when fire comes, I do not intend to be standing between a queen and a door, because the boy with the antlers can live or not. He is not my dog. Because the girl with the wolf eyes got out, and I am owed that." He glanced at Arya, who glared up at him with something like love wrapped in hatred and could not sort it and would not try. He grunted, "And because bread tastes better than gold." "Then eat with us?" Olenna said from behind Renly so suddenly that even Sandor flinched. "No man who tells the truth at this hour eats alone, or the truth will start to taste like bile and you will stop speaking it." He stared, blinked, and in that blink the dog stopped showing its teeth and sat, as if it had been told something it could understand. Sandor took the bowl she handed him and ate with the awkwardness of a man who has been slapped before for being seen doing something human. Night pulled up its hood. Fires coiled into themselves under lids of iron. The sea went from slate to ink. Every rope hummed with its own faint note. Together they made a music that put men to sleep if they let it and left them raw-nerved if they did not. Ned wrote one more letter with his daughters breathing in their corner and the smell of fish and smoke in the canvas. He wrote to Catelyn and told her nothing that would make her run and everything that would keep her from waking with her fists clenched. He told her the girls slept. He told her the North would not be bled for Lannister pride. He told her the law would sit. He did not say upon whom. At moon's fall, when the tide bellied and the chain on the river lay as slack as it would, Davos set his skiffs moving in a line that would have read to anyone watching as the motion of men too tired to try anything foolish. Each had a hook rigged to a length of rope brought up from a fisherman's loft near the Mandermouth, whose wife had kissed the rope as if it were a man going away to sea. The hooks kissed the bottom, clicked, caught, and then the men leaned their backs and made the kind of faces men make when they bend and want not to be seen bending. The chain lifted an inch, then a hair. Then it did not lift at all. "That's as much as we need," Davos murmured. "It is enough for a shallow draft galley to slope her nose. It is not enough to break ribs. The first 3 will tell us whether the jam we made holds when they lift the winch." "How many will you lose?" Stannis asked. "As many as we must," Davos said, without bravado, without apology. "I'll be in the first." "No," Stannis said. "You will be in the second. I am king enough to order you to live once." Davos looked at him and gave the ghost of a smile that did not reach his eyes because he liked his eyes too much to waste them on shallow comforts. He said, "once." Before dawn, the first 3 galleys nosed into the river like pigs testing a fence. The men aboard had been told what waited if the chain leapt. They had not been told what waited if the jars spilled and someone's hand shook and the spark found the mouth of a throat. They had not been told because men still go forward when they do not know the exact shape of death. They go less gladly when they do. From the city, a horn sounded high and frantic. Men ran along the wall like ants disturbed under a stone. The chain did not rise. The galleys slid. Arrows fell. A whisper at first and then a hiss as bowmen found their rhythm. Torch flared and died. The first galley reached the bend where the water narrowed and where Davos had felt the chain drag his line. The prow rose, bumped, slid, rose again, kissed iron and did not split. The oars bit and pushed them over, and then the boat fell into the river's deeper mouth with a lurch that made men vomit and laugh because they were still breathing. In the winch house by the King's Gate, 2 alchemists shoved at a capstan that would not bite, and a gold cloak with a birch chip in his pocket pushed until his veins stood and swore until his mouth went dry and the ratchet teeth slid and caught and slipped again. The chain did not rise. Someone shouted for the dwarf. The dwarf was elsewhere, inspecting a line of scorpions and adjusting the pegs that governed their tension with the fastidious patience of a craftsman, who knows that 1/8 of an inch fed to fear adds an hour of death to a morning. The second and third galleys came through, oars shredding water. Men on the wall shouted warnings. Men on the galleys shouted back something saltier and truer. A jar sailed from a parapet, hit water, and burst into cold flame that leapt across the river with a hunger that looked like joy. Men threw themselves flat. One oarsman kept his oar moving because he had been told to keep his oar moving until he was told not to, and no one had told him not to. The bow cut through fire that licked but did not devour when the river lapped higher for a breath and the flame sputtered. Behind them, Davos's galley came on, lower in the water, heavier with men and hooks and a piece of chain someone had prized loose in the night and stowed under a bench as if a relic might grant blessing. He squinted through smoke, spat into it, and grinned a wolf grin of his own when the winch jam fought itself and lost. By late morning, 5 shallow draft craft lay inside the river's throat, their sails furled, their oars biting slow to keep them from drifting into range of anchors the Lannister captains had dropped where they thought the chain would do their work for them. Davos ordered them to idle, rowing just enough to keep noses pointed upriver. They waited like knives placed under a cloak on the edge of a table. They looked small. Ned liked them because of that. He trusted small knives that had cut hard things before. On land, mantlets rolled forward under hail that rattled like raw peas in a drum. The first ram bumped the gate and backed, bumped and backed, learning the wall the way a dog learns a door he is not allowed to scratch. Stone answered with dull bell sounds that traveled into bone much further than into ear. Stannis did not shout. He spoke, and the words traveled down lines the way a tug on a hawser travels to a boat's nose. He stood while men stood, sat when they sat, ate when they ate if he remembered. He did not play at king. He was miserable with it and true. Around the 4th hour after noon, the city's bells changed their rhythm. Ned felt it in his chest before he understood it in his ear. It was not warning. It was not surrender. It was not him. It was the speed of men running and the weight of a thing released. He saw smoke at the corner of the guild hall and knew it had not come from error. Came from design. He did not think first of what would burn. He thought first of where the river wind lay. He turned his head and saw the flag at Stannis's tent show a breath from the southwest. Wind shifts with the new tide, Howland said next to him, as if they had always stood this close and he had always known Ned's thoughts. Then their jars will crawl toward us if we give them water enough to ride, Ned said. We will give them mud, Howland answered and whistled. The Crannigs moved. They pulled the stoppers from ditches and turned little runnels into rivulets and made a low place into a mire in 300 heartbeats. And the fire that leapt from the guild hall's eaves and went looking for something to wear found mud instead and looked sullen in it before it found a man's boot and wore that and made a scream. The scream lasted 10 heartbeats. Arya did not look away. Sansa closed her eyes, then opened them because to close them meant leaving the sound alone in her head, where it might grow into something worse. The watch along the Rose Road gate stood and did not shoot. One lowered his bow and rubbed his mouth with the back of his hand as if tasting something he had not asked to have in it. A woman ran along the wall inside the gate with a loaf lifted like a relic. She threw it down into the ditch. A boy jumped for it. 2 men lifted him by his belt and threw him back. The boy swore at them with a vocabulary older than the faith. A small thing happened then that no musician would have marked and no maester would have copied. The bowman who had rubbed his mouth lifted his bow and aimed not outward but inward, where the men had thrown the boy. He did not loose. He held until his arms shook. Then he set the arrow down and spat again. He did not think of himself as a symbol. He thought of his own son. Near sunset, the gate changed. Ned felt it before he saw it. The people beyond the mantlets made a sound that was not cheer and was not the cry of fear. The sound was a release, like someone who has had a splinter in his hand for too long letting it be pulled. A wheel squealed where it had always squealed too much for the wear upon it. A crossbar thumped where a bar thumps when men who do not love it lift it with care anyway. The Rose Road gate opened a hand's width. Then two. Then a man's width, which is also a child's width if the child has hands that can grip. No one moved at first. Stannis did not lift his hand. He let the moment show itself. From inside the gate, a cart rolled, slowly at first because everyone around it suspected a trap, and that suspicion made them clumsy. The cart bore bread. It bore oats. It bore a wooden disc with a clumsy leaf carved into it. The gold cloaks who flanked it did not look outward. They looked inward, at the faces inside their city. One of them made the smallest gesture with his hand, palm down, fingers flat, easy, and his men loosened their grips the way men loosen grips on reins when a horse sees a shadow and shies not because it is evil but because it has eyes. Renly looked at Stannis. Stannis looked at Ned. Ned nodded once, which meant nothing to anyone not watching their faces and meant as much as a bellow to the men who were. The mantlets rolled forward. The first line went down on one knee because this was not the hour to look like raiders. The ram did not go forward. The bread cart did. The space within the gate filled with bodies with nothing on their minds but bread, and bodies with too much and too little on their minds to be counted as anything more than human. "Hold," Stannis said, and his voice traveled in a way Ned still had not learned how to accomplish. He could make men love him. Stannis could make men stop. It was a gift in war. The cart cleared the gate. The gate closed half a hand. The bar did not fall. The gold cloaks who had let it open did not die for it. They took their places again and held their breath in ways no one could see. The boy who had sworn earlier tore a heel from the top of the nearest loaf and bit and cried because his mouth remembered what bread felt like when it came with laughter. By full dark, the first breach had not been made. No wall fell. No fire ran across the water unchecked. No gate swung wide and vomited men with knives. Yet camp felt older by a year and a winter. Ned visited each post he had promised himself he would. He spoke to Hallie's Hornwood and the Mormont woman and to a Tyrell Levy who kept turning his knife in his hands as if making sure it was still there. He told 2 boys to sleep. He told 1 boy to stand. He told Sandor Clegane to keep his dog close, and the dog flicked an ear and Sandor grunted, and that was enough. He sat with his daughters at last. Sansa had a splinter in her finger from a breadboard and would not let the splinter sit overnight. Ned pulled it with a needle he had cleaned in the fire, and she hissed and then laughed at herself. Arya showed him the map under her sleeve, refreshed in grease and sweat, and he kissed the edge of it, which embarrassed her and pleased her so much she scowled to hide it. "Tomorrow," he said, because men say that word to keep the present from eating them whole. "Tonight," Arya said, because she had crawled through enough tunnels to know how much can happen in darkness. He nodded. "And the night after, and the next day, and as long as we must until the law sits." Sansa lifted her eyes. "And after," he said, and looked toward the city and the wall and the river and the tents and the sea and the nets and the bread and the letters and the old woman who had threatened to flay his honor if he failed her grandchildren. "We will teach men to live in the peace they think they want. They do not know how," Sansa said, soft as dawn. "No," he said, stroking her hair back from her brow. "That is why it is our work." In the deepest hour before morning, when the sea went quiet as a held breath again and even the frogs at Howland's kettle slept, a spark took fire where it should not have. A jar had sweated on its shelf, and a drip had found a path, and a mouse had chewed a wick because wicks taste of tallow and because mice do not listen to gods. The flame ran a rope and reached a second jar, and the alchemist who slept with his mouth open did not wake before the world turned green, and his hair went away and the roof lifted its brows and came down. The fire did not run far. The wind took pity or had no pity to give yet. It guttered against stone and went out with a noise like a child's gasp. The city woke anyway and shouted its fear to itself, and then crowded back against its walls and listened to its own heart. At dawn, smoke hung low. The chain lay as Davos and his men had left it, sulking in silt. The girls slept late for the first time, and Ned let them. Stannis stood with a cup of water and drank like a man who will not owe a debt to thirst. Renly held his helm and looked into the curve of steel, not to see his face, but to see a shape that looked like a crown and to decide if he was glad he had set it down. Howland pulled a fish from a net he had dropped into a ditch and ate it raw and blue with cold satisfaction and practical gratitude. Bread moved. Letters moved. The law moved slower than both because it weighed more. Yet it moved. Ned felt it in the way men stepped aside and did not know why, in the way a captain of the watch smoothed his hand over a carved leaf and put it back in his pocket instead of tossing it on the midden. He felt it in the way the girl's breathing matched a rhythm he knew from winter hunts and wedding feasts and the mornings when one leaves to ride farther than one expects to. He drew ice and held it, not to swing it, but to remind himself of weight. The blade took the light in a way that made no show of it. It looked like water that had learned to hold its shape. He set it down again and looked at his hands. They were scarred a little more than last year and less than next. He closed them, opened them, and felt strength come and go as it always did. Behind the walls, the queen dressed her son and told him to look like a king. He frowned because kings did not frown when their mothers told them they must not. He set his mouth and said he would kill wolves and roses and stags. The queen smiled and kissed his brow with a mouth that tasted faintly of wine and iron. The bells and drums struck the hour. The space between them had narrowed to nothing. The day took its first breath. The siege leaned forward another inch, a hand upon a stone finding a new purchase, and the city, out of habit and pride and hunger and terror and hope, moved to meet it.